Josh Pate is always so good with his time. He's already joined us once this week, but you can never get enough of Josh Pate. 24/7 at Late Kick Josh is where you find him and follow his work the way we ask you to do for us. Welcome in, Josh. How are you tonight?
What time do you guys have to wake up in the morning?
That's
Are you doing a morning show?
We're doing our normal 9 to 12 is what the plan is right now.
We are less than 14 hours before live showtime.
But who's counting?
Yeah.
Okay. So this happens. You go live. What kind of feedback have you gotten? What has been the reaction from the masses since you've been live?
There's been a mixture of emotions. Early on, it was sadness, happiness for the years that they've enjoyed. And then, as you know, that lasted about 50 seconds. And they go quickly, well, who's the next coach? Can Caleb Downs leave? Is Jalen Milroe going to leave? Can all the recruits leave? Oh, Ryan Williams is already decommitted. And so it becomes instantly, thank you, Nick Saban. There will be time enough to celebrate you for the rest of my life. Now I'm worried about who's going to be on the field against Western Kentucky. So that's been the emotions.
Yeah, it's essentially the mentality that he would have has been ingrained inside every fan. So I don't think it's overstating things to call him the most feared and respected entity that has existed in the history of this game. At the very least, in the modern era. I told this story earlier tonight when we went live. When I grew up, I think I've talked to you guys about this before. When I grew up, I would hear stories about Bryant, but he was gone before I was born. So I viewed him the way normal people view Greek mythological figures. He was like more than a man, less than a god, but he was someone I couldn't imagine being around. I used to always idolize these sports writers who got to cover him, but I always thought to myself, I hate that I came along after that because I'll never get to witness that. I'll never get to experience that. And then January 3rd, 07 happens, and Bama hires Nick Saban. And it's not like it took a little while. It was a bomb that went off the day he was hired. Everyone knew it was going to work. The only question was, how long will he stay there? Because he hopped from Michigan State, hopped from LSU, hopped from the Dolphins, and he gives you a decade and a half. That would have been well over the total that Vegas would have set on the day he took the Bama job. But when he took that job, shortly thereafter, they did that Crimson Caravan speaking circuit. And he came to Columbus. I think in 08, he came down to Columbus, and I had to borrow $50 to go listen to him. But man, it was the first time that I had ever heard someone who I looked up to preach the message of being process-oriented over result-oriented. And at that time, I had no clue, no direction, no idea what I wanted to do in life. Trust me, it was a bleak situation. And it was like instantaneously that night. I will never forget this night. It lives very vividly in my memory. Hearing him and the way he put it and the way he presented that message, it was totally life-changing for me. And then you hear it over and over from him in his time at Alabama. That's how he impacted me. That's how him being at Alabama impacted me. But then because of that and a few other tumblers falling into place in my life, I get the privilege years later to not only watch him like everyone else, but cover it and sort of be behind the curtain and get to see the inner workings and be around him in Alabama. And I don't know if I'll do this 5 more minutes or 50 more years, but that right there will be the highlight of my career, being able to be around college football and covering Nick Saban at the apex of the dynasty that many people thought would never be able to be built at Alabama again. And that's the other big takeaway that I had. As soon as I heard this, I thought to myself, 16 years in, there's a whole generation of people who don't remember Bama pre-Saban, and they don't know how lost that program had become and how chained to mediocrity that program had become. And he walked in, and he was probably, guys, the only one in football that had the gravitas to be able to look Bama in the eye and say, you can either have that person or me. You can either have that group of folks or me. You can either do it this way or have me, but you can't have both. The Bama way of doing things had grown stale and sour, and he wasn't going to settle for it. And he wasn't going to come and do things the Alabama way. Alabama was going to have to do things the Nick Saban way. And man, it was the terror of the rest of the SEC and the biggest blessing in that program's modern era history that they checked yes instead of no on that. And then the other thing that I'm sure you guys have talked about a lot tonight, but the other thing that I will never forget about him is how many times he had to reinvent his program on the fly, and he never took a step back. Program never took a step back. Dabo right now at Clemson just went 8-4 because he's having to redefine some things about his program. Saban did it 5 or 6 times. He replaced coordinators every other cycle. He had an army of guys go to the draft. He had an army of assistants elevate to coordinators and head coaches elsewhere, and he never was removed a single year as the apex predator in the sport. That program was the standard bearer in the sport for a decade and a half. And even as the sport changed, he was always one step ahead of it. And it was what a pleasure to be able to witness that. And what a bombshell now it is for the rest of college athletics, because this thing will impact everyone in some shape, form, or fashion.
Yeah, it's very, very well put. And, a lot of people spend a lot of time saying the game had passed Nick Saban by. This is the end of the Saban dynasty. That dynasty got shot a lot of times and never once bled out. So it is interesting that he retired the way he did to me, because there were so many people that started writing the obituary of his dominant coaching career, not his coaching career, but his dominant coaching career. And right up to the very end, me, you, Jim, a lot of us stood on that field and watched them lose in overtime in the college football semifinals. His dominant coaching career never really ended. And we just don't get to see that a lot in coaching.
No, you don't. It's all. How do you exit gracefully? How do you do that? The longer you're at a place, the longer you do something, the longer it can come to define who you are. And Nick Saban, when you ask people about him, and even in his free time, his leisurely time, whatever that was for him, it always got back to football pretty quickly. So, we witnessed Joe Paterno go out the way Joe Paterno did. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about independent of all the off the field stuff, just Joe Paterno, the football coach, hanging on well past his prime and, walking around without a headset. And I remember they came, what was it, like 2010, 2011, when they had that home and home with Bama. I bought a ticket to go to the game in Tuscaloosa just because I knew probably one of my last shots to be able to say I saw Joe Paterno coach a game. But Joe Paterno wasn't running that program at that point. That had long since become a figurehead position, and the coordinators and down the line, they're running the program. Dude, anyone who said that was what Bama was had no earthly idea what they were talking about. I did wonder, if you got me on the record, I never would have said this is going to be it. This is the year for him. And then to hear the stories about him being on the SEC head coaches teleconference earlier today, interviewing guys for positions as recently as this week, his coaching staff not having a clue until right up until the announcement today. That's a surprise for everyone. And you guys are well sourced. I got a couple of folks I can talk to as well. I don't think many people in his inner circle really had much of an idea this was coming. And I'm talking about family as well now. So, here's what history will do. History will remember it as, well, we all saw it coming, this, that, and the other. And it'll all be anecdotal because almost no one knew what was coming and when it was coming. But I will say this, and Dunaway pointed it out, you get emotional and you go retrospective for about 10 or 15 seconds, and then your mind shifts to, oh, wait, the Bama job's open. I haven't said that since 2006. Yep. What are they about to do? What's going to happen to the roster? And look, I've probably learned more about coaching searches in the past year than I knew my entire life combined before that. And what I've learned most of the time is searches don't really happen the way that the public thinks they happen. I don't think a coaching search is happening here either. I think 95% of that legwork is done. And whether Greg Byrne knew this a month ago, a week ago, or a day ago, they are well down the road in what they're going to do. And I think you guys have already talked about that a lot tonight. I'd be interested because I've been doing my own show, Brown and Dunaway. What have you guys said on air? What have you heard?
Well, first let me say that someone inside the program who was in the meeting, I had texted about 2:30, 3 o'clock, and I said, we're starting to hear from the agent side of this that, this could be going down today. And he is like, dude, we've been interviewing candidates to replace, holes on the coaching staff. That's what we've been doing today with Nick Saban. So the guy worked up until it was closing time. He put his pen down on his desk and he went to that 4 o'clock meeting and told his players before this leaked out. So, that is, to me, I get chills telling that story that, he is going to work for his employer for the good of the program and of those kids and his assistants until it is time for me to go to this 4:00 meeting where I'm going to walk in and surprise the hell out of everybody and tell them that's it for me. I'm done. And so that, like you, that was the reaction by people that was on that coaching staff today. As far as the search, I agree with you that there is a plan in place. I think personally it has to go fast because we are in an era of college football that, and I remember telling a Michigan fan this about, oh, you guys are lucky you got Caleb Downs at Alabama for the next 2 years. And I was like, dude, Caleb Downs is like any other player. It's a year-to-year deal. Hopefully he's at Alabama 2 more years. So from Caleb Downs to Jalen Milroe to anybody in between, that roster is wide open right now. So I don't think you can go as long as the search for Nick Saban went on back in the day.
Yeah, it's funny. The more you learn about the mechanisms involved in coaching searches, Jimmy Sexton and CAA, obviously a power player here, and you know that even if they're locked in, let's just say for the sake of argument, they were locked in on Dan Lanning, and let's say that thing was agreed to in principle 5 hours ago. Normally, the way that would work is they'd say, all right, now hold on, and we need to leak this here, we need to let that simmer over there because I got a list of clients that I need to get raises right quick, and then 72 hours, give me 72 hours, and let's float some things here and there, and then let's hand this to this reporter and that to that talk show host. But then we'll cement this in writing 72 hours from now. I agree with you. I don't know that that's the way this is going to work right now because Greg Byrne nor anyone at the University of Alabama is interested in saying, all right, we'll do you the favor. They don't care about the rest of his clients. That's not the way we're thinking right now. And so, I don't know if we're talking about tomorrow morning or the next morning. I'd be very surprised if this thing goes 48, 72 hours. If it does, that means no has been said. That's the only path that I see that going.
So let's just, again, for those that mentioned it in the chat and people that were texting us and tweeting us, you've not said, well, let's just clarify exactly what you said on your show earlier that led people to tell us you were saying you knew who the coach is and he's already been hired or whatever they said.
Yeah. I can't believe you weren't watching, Brown. That's terrible. So you guys been doing something?
I was watching. I just couldn't turn it up because we were on the show, but I was watching.
Probably the best way to consume my content.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
So let me give you a little backstory. So in Pasadena, when we were at the Rose Bowl, even in Atlanta, when we were at the SEC championship game, there were some murmurs about this. In Pasadena, the murmurs were a little bit louder. In Houston this past weekend, there were about 3 or 4 people who were pretty reputable who told me, be on the lookout for this. And I'll just stop there. So be on the lookout for it.
Yeah.
At that point, if I'm hearing it and it's valid, then people who are going to be involved in the decision-making know about it and they're already putting those wheels in motion. Okay. So whatever you call a search is already happening. So what I said on the show tonight was informed by a lot of the conversations I had this past weekend. And what I said is, you're going to see a lot of articles about coaching searches because those click very well. That's like cocaine and chum in the water combined from a search engine optimization perspective right now. So you're going to hear a lot about coaching searches. I said, this will not be a coaching search. It won't be much of a search at all. It'll be a, hey, you're our guy. Here's the piece of paper, sign it, it's done. And a lot of that may have already been done because you got to understand how this stuff works, man. It's about who represents you. And the same guy that represents Nick Saban represents a lot of other big names. And that's how assistant coaching searches go now, much less head coaching searches. So it would be my belief that if Greg Byrne and Alabama have zeroed in who you and me both think that they've probably zeroed in on, that's take 24 hours to sleep on it. We need an answer and let's get this thing rolling. That's not much of a coaching search to me.
So let's take Dan Lanning. Why would he work and what concerns you about him working at Alabama?
Just lack of longevity as a head coach is the only thing that would concern me. I think the potential for Dan Lanning is sky high.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a big believer in Dan Lanning.
Me too.
And know him fairly well. I'm telling you, you probably see it on TV, but when you're around him, that's one of the more intense guys in the profession. That's a Kirby Smart level of intensity. That is a Nick Saban level of intensity. And it's funny, Saban used to give the quotes. I've been around him a few times, and he said, passion can look like aggression to someone who's not motivated. And when I'm around folks like Lanning, he rubs some people in media the wrong way because of his intensity. And he's the same way Nick Saban is. Kirby's not as much this way. Saban was this way. You've seen him take the heads off reporters before, but when you really dive into why, it's normally because a stupid question got asked. And you got taught there are no stupid questions, and that's a lie. Teachers lied to you. There are plenty of stupid questions. And Manning's the same way. Like, he's got a very hot and cold relationship with a lot of the media in the Pacific Northwest. But I've sat there one-on-one with him. I have no problem whatsoever. It's just you have to ask substantive questions, and you'll get a very substantive and thoughtful response. But he does not fit. He did not fit in the Pac-12 paradigm. There are a lot of jokes to be made about how they went 0-2 against Washington this year. What's his best win? That dude's 2 years into his head coaching career as well. Okay, so the mistake a lot of people make in this sport because of guys like Nick Saban is they hold you to a standard of someone who's a 30 or 35-year industry veteran, and you're 2 or 3 years in, you're still learning which way is up. You're still learning how to run an organization, how to put together your own rubric. And the fact of the matter is, Dan Lanning's probably going to be a winner in this game for a long time, whether he's at Oregon or Alabama or anywhere in between. The part of it that I guess would work, well, there are several parts that I think would work. He eats, sleeps, and breathes recruiting. He understands the portal. They are so aggressive about that. The part that may not work is the same kind of stuff that may derail any coach. It's the pressure cooker that is the job, which I think he's made for, so I don't worry about that much. But I don't know. I mean, following up a legend and the expectation level being warped, I think could be something that's a pitfall for anyone. But you guys have probably talked about this at some point tonight. There's that adage out there that you don't want to be the guy who follows the legend.
Oh, yeah.
And I've always thought that's BS. For the right person, that's BS. Now, for 99% of the candidates, it's accurate, it's factual. But you're not looking for 99%. You're already looking for a 1%er. And trust me, there are guys out there who are capable of doing the job, and two, are wired the total opposite way as conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom says, I don't want to follow the legend. The right guy says, I'll be better than him. Now, whether you think anyone's going to ever match or exceed what Nick Saban did, that's irrelevant. You want someone who thinks that way because they're wired in the way that's the only way that's going to work at Alabama. So Dan Lanning would be a grand slam hire to me. It'd be also a grand slam if Oregon was able to keep him.
Let me give you some examples of not wanting to follow legends. Paterno at Penn State, Bowden at Florida State. But I would tell you that those coaches fell way off at the end of their career. They stayed longer than they should, and those programs were just replicas of what they used to be. I take you to Miami in their heyday when they would change coaches. The recruits were still there, and the next guy would follow another guy who won a national championship and would come in and win another national championship. Why? Because he had great players. And that's why I think this is different than following even Bear Bryant, who after 79, it slipped a little in 80, it slipped a little in 81, it slipped a little in 82, and you had to rebuild Alabama a little bit. Right now, if you could do it quick, this isn't a rebuild job. And you are following the legend of all time, but you're doing it with arguably the best roster in college football. You don't get that often.
Yeah, so we don't know what the next chapter looks like yet, but when you tell the story of Nick Saban 20 years down the road, I think we may be glossing over we're not glossing over it. We're talking about one of the most important chapters, and that is when you hit the exit door on top, you do such a service to whoever's coming after you. You do such a service to the fan base because you don't have to wander in the wilderness if you make the right hire. And if you don't make the right hire, that's a total different can of worms. But I mean, think about telling the story of the biggest icon, the most feared entity in the history of this game at the coaching position, just running roughshod over the sport for a decade and a half, 15 more first-round draft picks than losses, and he hit the exit door at or very near his prime, and the next guy, whoever it is, was able to come in and take those keys and rev the engine, and it was as seamless a transition as you could have. That would be one of the most important chapters for the longevity of Alabama football.
Yep.
That's a great point, yeah. I mean, I don't know what he looks like in retirement. I don't know that Nick Saban, to a certain extent, if Dan Lanning or Mike Norvell or whoever gets that job, the best service Nick Saban could be to them is kind of disappear and not look like – I'll tell you who you don't want is you don't want Barry Alvarez. You don't want Barry Alvarez. Barry Alvarez retired from coaching at Wisconsin, but never could get away from it.
Pat died to some degree.
Spot. Yeah, he kept his parking spot.
Yeah, he kept his parking spot. Now, by the way, anytime a coach would leave because they couldn't get along with Barry Alvarez, who coached the bowl game?
Barry Alvarez.
Yeah. So, I mean, you do not want that. That's what you do not want for the next Alabama coach. That's a tough spot for Nick Saban because you love the program. You want to show your love for the program, but to be fair to the next guy, you can't be the vulture hanging over, looking over the program. You kind of have to disappear a little bit.
Yeah, but you got to be supportive.
You got to
be Clinton to Bush. If the president calls you up, the former president, you take the call. You give him all the information he needs to help him out, but you don't get in the way.
See, and Pate, you grew up in this area down in Columbus. I mean, close enough to know that Pat Dye would go on Paul Feinbaum's show every week and break down Auburn football, and that was completely unfair to Terry Bowden and Tommy Tuberville and Gus Malzahn and Gene Chizik. I mean, it was just the coach that had been successful breaking down what the next coach did. That was so unfair to those guys.
You know, I remember Pat Dye going on one time, and this was when Charlie Weiss was the OC at Florida, I want to say.
Okay.
And there were those shots where occasionally Charlie Weiss would just sit on a cooler or sit on a bucket.
Yeah.
And Pat Dye said, "You know, Paul, the only thing I felt worse for than those players on that team was that poor cooler. And that cooler got the biggest workout of the day Saturday." Yeah, I remember that. I had forgotten all about that entire era. Man, Feinbaum, he threaded a little needle there for a little while with the guest interviews. But I think, look, I think his future, like Nick Saban, is not stepping away from football, I don't think. He's got media if he wants it. Look, man, he could have all kind of business ventures that involve like minority ownership in teams at the NFL level. He can do anything he wants to. But I also was thinking about this on air earlier tonight. You know as well as I do, because you guys have been very close to the program and in that market for a long time. You've got stories about him you've never told. Many people who cover the program have got stories you've never told. And many people who've worked for him and played for him have got stories they've never told. Some of those will never see the light of day. But you know as well as I do, there's this little satchel that everyone carries around who's been close to him of stories that they've just saved for when he retires. I cannot tell this story until he retires. But once he retires, I'll be able to tell this story or that story. And I think over the coming weeks, we may hear some of the most interesting Nick Saban-related content that we've ever heard in his entire time at Alabama because of this.
We used to joke, and it actually ended when Nick Saban started winning in Tuscaloosa. But every summer in our radio days, we would get roughly 2 to 3 brown packets that would show up on each of our desks when we'd get there. And before we would open them, we would look at each other and we'd like, wonder who wrote this Bear Bryant book. And it was that way all the way until 2008. Every summer, there was 1, 2, 3 Bear Bryant books years after he was done.
Oh, yeah. And it was one of Dunaway's funniest lines ever. I opened one of them and I was like, "Oh, this is great quotes from Bear Bryant." Dunaway said, "Are they all written in red?" It's a good line. If you know your biblical, if you know your Bible, that's
if you're a Southern Christian, that means a lot to you.
Yeah.
Yes.
But no, I mean, he's got to thread the needle of being publicly supportive, but not demonstrative, not overlooking. That could be a tough needle to thread, especially if he's on College Game Day or something like that. I think Alabama's probably going to be a topic on College Game Day at some point.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But here's you know why I think he'll handle it well? Think about the characters he's had come through there, both as players and as coaches. Some of them are current head coaches elsewhere. And think of all the garbage he's dealt with behind the scenes and the opportunities that he could have rightly thrown people under the bus and yet still spoke glowingly of them and was very above board respectful about it. I highly doubt we'd see Nick Saban overly critical of an Alabama head coach down the road if he's on game day or, whatever the case may be. I think he'll do it pretty gracefully. But the one thing I wonder about him, and we'll find out now, is I've always wondered, how open is he willing to be when he's not coaching anymore? How critical is he willing to be? What kind of stories is he willing to tell? What does that Nick Saban authorized book look like? And what does it contain? And how many stories that never saw the light of day because he put the clamp on it do we all of a sudden find out? Is there a side of Nick Saban? Are there more hard and fast thoughts that he's had for a long time that he's just kept to himself because it wouldn't serve the greater good of Alabama football if he shared them? All that stuff's on the table now.
Yeah, that is fascinating. All right, he is Josh Pate. You guys know him from our show. We love having Josh on at 24/7 Sports at Late Kick Josh. At Late Kick Josh is where you go. Find him on YouTube. Give him a thumbs up. Subscribe. Set your alerts. Follow him on social media everywhere at Late Kick Josh. Thank you very much for the time, Josh. It's twice this week. That's still not enough.
And I'll probably see you guys by Friday.
Yeah, we'll talk to you Friday. Thank you. Every other day with Pate. See you, Pate. Thank you very much.
Come back on when we have a new head coach.
Yeah,
right?
Josh Pate with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. Okay.